Danny Voss had been flying cargo ships. Since he was 19 years old, he was now 31, and his freighter, the Drifter, looked every bit as tired as those 12 years suggested. The paint was chipped. The left thruster rattled during docking. The cockpit smelled like old coffee and engine grease, but it flew. And it paid the bills, and Danny never asked for much more than that. He was coming in hot toward Cradle Point, the biggest orbital station in the SR system. Cradle Point was a monster of a structure, a spinning ring of metal and light that hung above a pale blue world. Like a silver crown, hundreds of ships docked there every day: traders, diplomats, military cruisers, refugee transports. If you were traveling through this part of the galaxy, you passed through Cradle Point. Danny had been here dozens of times, but today the approach went wrong. His navigation system glitched halfway through the corridor, and the Drifter drifted, true to its name, into a restricted sensor lane reserved for military vessels. Warning lights flashed across his console. A sharp alien voice crackled through the comm system, ordering him to cut his engines and prepare for inspection. He sighed, leaned back in his seat, and muttered, "Here we go." 2 Valith officers were waiting for him at the docking gate. The Valith were tall, insectoid creatures with hard black shells and 4 arms that moved in sharp, precise motions. Their eyes were like dark glass, and they never blinked. Most species found them frightening. Danny just found them strict. The first officer scanned his ship's registry. The second one studied his face with a handheld device that read his biometrics: heartbeat, temperature, species identification. He had learned a long time ago that arguing with station security only made things slower. The first officer looked at the scan results, then he looked at Danny, then he looked at the results again. Human. The officer said it was not a question. Yep, Danny said. The officer folded 2 of his forearms behind his back, handed Danny his clearance chip, and stepped aside. "You may proceed." Danny blinked. "That's it. I crossed into a restricted lane. Don't you need to file something?" The officer's dark eyes stared at him without expression. "You are human. You are exempt. Proceed." Danny took the chip, shrugged, and walked through the gate. He had seen this happen before, not every time, but often enough that it no longer surprised him. Humans got waved through. He never really thought about why, but someone else did. 3 levels above the docking bay, standing on a wide observation balcony that overlooked the arrivals floor, a Tessari named Keel. Dassin watched the whole thing happen. Heel was young by Tessari standards, barely 40 cycles, which made him something like a fresh graduate in human terms. He was lean, scaled, and deep green, with narrow golden eyes that missed very little. He wore the formal gray coat of a junior ambassador, and he had been stationed on Cradle Point for almost a year. In that year, Keel had filed over 200 clearance forms. He had waited in lines. He had submitted to scans, interviews, background checks, and diplomatic reviews just to access the mid-tier levels of the station. Every species on Cradle Point followed the same process. The Veil, the Morvathi, the Drenni, the Tessari. Everyone waited. Everyone filed forms. Everyone followed the universal transit codes set down by the Vayoran Accord, the galactic coalition that governed all of known space. Everyone except the humans. Keel had watched it happen again and again. Human ship would dock. Security would scan the pilot. The moment the system Confirmed the species human, the gates. Opened, no forms, no clearance, no questions. It made no sense to him. He turned away from the balcony and walked to his small office on the diplomatic level. He sat at his desk, opened his terminal, and pulled up the founding charter of the Vayoran Accord. It was a massive document, thousands of pages long, written in formal intergalactic standard. Key had read parts of it during his training, but never the whole thing. Now he searched for one specific section, the transit exemption codes. He found it buried deep in the charter. Appendix, Article 7, Section 44. Subsection 12. It was only 3 lines long. All species operating within Vayoran Accord space shall comply with standard transit authorization protocols, exception species designation. H7012. Human Terran origin shall be granted unrestricted passage through all controlled zone stations and territories without prior authorization. This exemption is permanent and may not be revoked or amended. Keel read it twice, then a third time. Permanent may not be revoked, may not be amended. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. In all his studies he had never seen a rule like this in any coalition charter. Transit codes were the backbone of galactic security. They existed to prevent invasions, smuggling, espionage. Exempting an entire species was not just unusual, it was unheard of. He searched for the voting record attached to the article. When he found it, his scales tightened with shock. Exemption had passed unanimously. Every founding species, all 19 of them, had voted yes. Not a single objection, not a single abstention. But the reasoning behind the vote was locked, classified under the highest restriction tier in the Accord's records. Peel did not have the clearance to access it. He sat in silence for a long time. Then he opened a comm channel to the only person he trusted enough to ask. His old mentor, a retired Tessari Scot named Orin, who lived on the home world and spent his days writing about ancient galactic politics. Orin's face appeared on the screen, old, weathered scales, tired eyes, but a mind still sharp as a blade. Keel, Orin said warmly, it has been too long. I need to ask you something. Kale said, about the founding charter, about the human exemption. The warmth faded from Orin's face. His eyes became careful. I see, Orin said slowly. You know about it. It was not a question. I know enough to tell you to stop asking. Why? Orin was quiet for a moment, then he said, some doors stay shut for a reason. Key, not every truth needs to be found. Key wanted to argue, but the look on Orin's face stopped him. It was not anger, it was not secrecy, it was something closer to fear. After the call ended, Key sat alone in his office. He should have listened to Orin, he should have let it go, but curiosity was not something a Tessari could easily set aside. Their entire culture was built on the pursuit of knowledge. Walking away from a mystery went against everything Keo believed in. He spent the next 3 hours searching through secondary databases, old diplomatic logs archived, communications, anything that might reference the human exemption without being classified. But deep in a corrupted file from the Accord's earliest days, buried under layers of damaged data, he found a fragment, an audio recording barely 10 seconds long. The voice belonged to a Drenni commander, one of the original founders of the Accord. The recording was distorted, broken, and full of static, but the Words were clear enough, do not lock them out, whatever you do, never lock the humans out. The recording ended. Heel played it again and again. He sat in the dim light of his office, listening to the fear in a dead commander's voice, and he knew he was not going to stop. Key could not get the voice out of his head. He played the audio fragment 7 more times before he finally closed the file and pushed away from his desk. The fear in that dead commander's voice was real. It was old and it was deep, and it came from someone who had seen something terrible. He needed more. The station archives on Cradle Point were good, but they only went back so far. If he wanted the full story, he would have to go to the surface, to Asara itself, where the oldest records in the galaxy were kept. The deep archives of Asara were maintained by the Morvafi. They were the oldest known species in the Vaoran Accord, slow, patient aquatic beings with long, silver bodies and soft voices that seemed to come from everywhere. At once, the Morvathi remembered things that other species had forgotten. Centuries ago, they kept records not out of duty, but out of something closer to instinct. Forgetting to a Morvathi was the same as dying. Keel had a contact among them, a Morvathi archivist named Ulizi, whom he had met during a cultural exchange program 2 years ago. Ulizi was calm, thoughtful, and difficult to read, like most of her kind. But she owed Keel a favor. He had helped her translate a set of ancient Tessari texts that no one else could decode. Now he was going to collect. He sent her a message. She responded within the hour. She would grant him limited access to the deep archive, but she warned him he would only be allowed to read. No copying, no recording, and he could not share what he found without Morvathi approval. Key agreed and took the next shuttle to the surface. While Key descended through the pale blue clouds of Asara, Danny Voss was already back in space. He had picked up a new contract, a cargo run to fringe colony called HFY. The colony was under quarantine. A fungal outbreak had swept through the settlement, and the local medical teams were overwhelmed. Somebody needed to deliver supplies, and nobody else had volunteered. Danny did not volunteer out of courage or heroism. He volunteered because the pay was decent and the route was short. That was how he explained it to himself. Anyway, his co-pilot for the run was a woman named Nora Beckett. She was a field medic, 35 years old, brown hair pulled back tight, steady hands, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from having seen too many bad days and survived all of them. She had been working on fringe colonies for 6 years, patching up miners, treating alien diseases, pulling people back from the edge. She didn't talk much, and when she did, she meant every word. They were 2 hours into the flight when Danny brought it up. Hey Nora, you ever think about why we get free passage everywhere? Nora looked up from her medical inventory list. What do you mean? Like at station checkpoints, we just walk through, no forms, no clearance. Every alien has to wait in line, but we just go. Nora shrugged. People don't lock their doors against the ones who save their house from burning down. Danny waited for her to say more. She didn't. She went back to counting antibiotics. That's it, he said. That's your whole explanation. I don't need to explain it. Nora said it happened before we were born. Somebody did something good, and we're still living off the credit. Best thing we can do is not waste it. Danny wanted to push further, but Nora's tone made it clear the conversation was Over, he turned back to the controls and watched the stars slide past. On the surface of Asara, Key entered the deep archive. It was not what he expected. The Morvathi did not store their records in computers or data banks. The archive was a vast underground lake, dark and still with bioluminescent symbols drifting through the liquid like living text. To read the records, Keel had to use a translation device that converted the light patterns into text on a screen, guided him through the system. She moved through the water with slow grace, her silver body catching the dim light. She did not ask Keel why he was here. She already knew. You are looking for the other breach, she said. Keel froze. How did you know? Because everyone who asks about the human exemption ends up here. And the answer is always the same. She led him to a deeper part of the archive, where the water was colder and the light was dimmer. The symbols here were older. Some of them predated the Accord by decades. Key sat on the stone edge of the pool and began to read. The other breach. It had happened 42 standard years before the Varan Accord was founded. An extragalactic species, the Ether, had broken through into the local cluster via collapsed wormhole near the outer rim. Nobody knew where they came from. Nobody knew what they wanted. They did not communicate. They did not negotiate. They consumed worlds, stations, fleets. The other devoured everything in their path like a fire, eating through dry wood. The existing alliances tried to respond, but they were too slow. Fear spread faster than the Ira themselves. One by one, the major species did what fear always tells you to do. They closed their borders. The Valith sealed their military corridors. The Tessari locked down their colony networks. The Morvathi retreated into their deep ocean worlds and shut the surface gates. The Drenni activated planetary shields and cut all external communications. Every species looked at the approaching storm and decided the same thing. Protect what is yours. Lock the doors. Shut out the unknown. The result was a disaster beyond anything the era could have caused on their own. Refugee ships were turned away at every border. Millions of civilians, families, children, the old and the sick were left floating in open space with nowhere to go. Military fleets that could have joined together to fight were trapped behind their own government's lockdowns. Scientists who had been working on ways to close the wormhole could not reach each other. Supply lines collapsed. Communication networks went dark. The galaxy did not fall to the era, it fell to its own fear. And then the humans did something that nobody else would do. They opened their doors. Key read the record slowly, carefully, making sure he understood every detail. Humanity at the time of the era breach was a small species. They had only been traveling between stars for about 200 years. Their ships were average. Their weapons were nothing special. Their population was a fraction of the Valith or the Tessari. By every measurable standard, they were unremarkable. But when the lockdowns began, the humans refused to follow. They did not seal their borders. They did not shut their stations. Instead, they broadcast a message on every open channel in every known language to every species in range. Our doors are open. If you need shelter, come to us. If you need fuel, come to us. If you need to fight, stand with us. We will not turn you away. And they meant it. Human stations took in refugees by the thousands. Human ports let foreign warships dock, refuel, and rearm without asking for anything in Return. Human pilots flew into active war zones to evacuate civilians that their own governments had abandoned. Behind locked gates, they became the only connective thread in a galaxy that had torn itself apart. Keel's hands trembled as he read. He was not an emotional being by nature. Tari valued logic and order above all things, but the scale of what he was reading shook him in a way he was not prepared for. It was not the bravery that struck him. Many species were brave. The Valeth were legendary warriors. The Drenni had fought wars that lasted centuries. It was the trust the humans had opened their doors, knowing that any ship could be carrying the era, knowing that they were making themselves vulnerable, knowing that it could cost them everything. They did it anyway. At the bottom of the record, Key found a personal log entry from a Morvathi fleet commander who had been alive during the breach. The entry was short and written in a tone that Key had never seen in Morvathi writing, raw, unfiltered, almost desperate. The humans kept their doors open when every rational mind said to shut them, and that single act of irrational trust saved us all. Peel stared at the words until the light from the water blurred his vision. Ulizi floated nearby, watching him in silence. Now you understand, she said softly. Kale shook his head. Not yet. I need to know what happened during the breach itself, the battles, the evacuations. I need to know who did this. Ulysses was quiet for a moment. Then she drifted deeper into the archive, and the water around her began to glow with older, heavier light. Then follow me, she said, and I will show you the ones who flew through the fire. The deeper part of the archive was colder. The light that drifted through the water here was not the soft blue of the upper levels. It was amber, heavy and slow-moving, as if the memories stored in this place carried weight. Key pulled his coat tighter around his scaled shoulders and sat on the stone ledge as Ulysses brought the old records to life. What followed was not a summary. It was not a report. It was the raw, unfiltered account of 11 days that changed the galaxy forever. Eli Marsh was 38 years old when the era breach reached the Tessari border colonies. He was the captain of a mid-range human cruiser called the Long Path, a ship built for long hauls, not combat. It had decent engines, basic shielding, and a crew of 112 people who were used to hauling freight between outer rim settlements. They were workers. When the lockdowns began, Eli was docked at a refueling station. The Tessari border. He watched the galactic communications network go dark, one channel at a time. First the Drenni went silent, then the veil sealed their military frequencies, then the Tessari government issued a full border closure. Every gate, every corridor, every station in Tessari space was locked down. Nothing in, nothing out. Within hours, the distress calls started. The first came from a Tessari civilian transport carrying 4,000 refugees, families who had fled the outer colonies. When the era arrived, they had reached a Tessari border station, but the station refused to open its gates. Government orders, no exceptions. The transport was running out of air. The second call came from a group of Valeth soldiers stranded on a damaged outpost. Their fleet had retreated behind the Valeth blockade, and no one was coming back for them. They had no medical supplies. They were asking anyone at all to help. The third call came from a Morvathi research team on a deep space lab. They had been studying the collapsed wormhole. When the HFY poured through, they had data, critical data about the wormhole, structure that might help close it. But they were trapped behind a tesserae, quarantine zone, and no one would let them out. Eli listened to all three calls. He stood on the bridge of the long path, hands on the railing, staring at the navigation map. Every route to those people passed through sealed gates, locked corridors, and military blockades. Going in without authorization meant breaking the laws of at least 3 sovereign species. It meant risking his ship, his crew, and his life. His first officer, Carla Dunn, stood beside him. Carla was sharp, cautious, and practical. She was the one who kept the long path running when everything else fell apart. She looked at the same map and saw the same thing Eli did. We don't have the firepower to force through blockade, she said. And if the Athera catch us in open space, we're dead. I know, Eli said. So what do you want to do? Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he reached for the shipwide comm and opened a channel to every member of his crew. This is the captain, he said. I'm not going to lie to you. What I'm about to do is dangerous, and it's probably illegal. There are people out there, thousands of them, trapped behind locked doors. Their own governments left them to die. I'm going to go get them. Anyone who wants off, I'll drop you at the nearest open port. No judgment, but I'm going, and I'm going now. Not a single person left. Eli turned to the main Come and broadcast on all channels. Tari, Valith, Morvathi, every frequency he could reach. This is Captain Eli Marsh of the human vessel, Long Path. We are coming through. Do not fire. Then he flew straight into the sealed corridors. The first gate they hit was a tesserae quarantine seal, a massive energy barrier designed to stop warships. Long Path was not a warship, and it did not try to break through by force. Instead, Eli's engineer, a quiet young man named Sam Hadley, hacked the gates control system from the outside. It took him 14 minutes working in a pressurized suit on the hull of the ship while the long path drifted in open space. When the gate opened, Carla pulled the ship through before it could close again. On the other side, they found the tesserae transport, 4,000 people packed into a ship designed for 2,000, running on emergency power. The air was thin. Children were crying. The adults had stopped talking hours ago. They were just sitting in the dark, waiting to die. Eli docked the long path alongside the transport, opened every airlock, and his crew began moving people. They gave up their own bunks, their own food, their own air. Within 2 hours, the transport's passengers were aboard the long path, and the convoy moved on. Next stop was the Vale outpost. This was harder. The outpost was inside a Vale military zone, and the blockade around it was run by Admiral Thesic, a veteran Vale commander known for following orders without question. They had been told to seal the zone. He sealed the zone. Nothing personal, just duty. When the long path approached the blockade, Thesic opened the channel. Human vessel, you are entering a restricted military zone. Turn back or you will be fired upon. Eli did not turn back. Admiral, I have 4,000 tesserae civilians on board, and I'm heading to pick up your wounded soldiers on that outpost. You can fire on me, but you'll have to explain to your own people why you killed their sons to keep a gate shut. Thesic did not respond for a long time. The long path kept moving. Carla gripped the armrest of her chair. He's Going to fire, she whispered. He didn't. The blockade held its position. But the guns stayed silent. The long path passed through and docked at the outpost. Eli's crew carried the wounded Valith soldiers aboard on stretchers. Some of them were barely alive. The medics worked through the night. By the third day, word had spread. Other human ships, small freighters, passenger shuttles, even a couple of private yachts began joining the long path. They came from every direction, answering the distress calls that no one else would answer. A patchwork fleet held together by nothing but stubbornness and a refusal to let strangers die behind locked doors. On the fifth day they reached the Morvathi research team. The quarantine zone around the lab was sealed tight, and this time the gate could not be hacked. Sam Hadley tried for 2 hours and failed. The system was too advanced, so Eli did something reckless. He flew the long path directly against the gate, not to ram it but to physically dock with the gate's manual release mechanism on the outer hull. It was a maneuver that should have been impossible. The ship took damage. The lower hull buckled. 3 crew members were injured, but the gate opened and the Morvathi scientists were pulled aboard. It contained the structural map of the collapsed wormhole, the key to shutting it down and sealing the era out for good. On the 8th day, the era caught up with them. A swarm of era attack ships hit the convoy. The Asara corridor. The long path took a direct strike to its lower deck. The blast tore through 2 compartments and killed 9 crew members instantly. Eli was thrown across the bridge and hit the far wall hard enough to break 3 ribs and crack his spine. He could not stand. He could barely breathe. Carla took the helm. Sam kept the engines running. The rest of the crew fought fires, sealed breaches, and kept the civilians alive. Eli commanded from a stretcher, giving orders through clenched teeth, blood on his face, his voice never once wavering. 2 of the escort ships were destroyed. 47 humans died in those 11 days. 47 people who had no obligation to be there, who could have locked their doors and stayed safe, and who chose not to. On the 9th day, something changed. Admiral Fesk, the same Vale commander who had threatened to fire on the long path, watched from his flagship as the human convoy limped toward the Asara gateway, carrying his own soldiers on their decks. He watched them bleed for people they had never met. He opened the blockade, not just the gap, the entire blockade, and then he turned his fleet around and joined the convoy. Other fleets followed. The Tessari sent ships. The Drenni broke their silence. Even the Morvathi, who had not fought a war in 3 centuries, sent armed escorts. The combined fleet reached the Asara gateway on the 11th day. Together they held the line against the Afra long enough for the Morvathi scientists to activate the wormhole collapse sequence. The gateway shook. Space itself seemed to crack, and then the wormhole sealed shut and the era were gone. Eli Marsh died 3 days later. His injuries were too severe. The medics did everything they could, but his body had given everything it had. He passed quietly in the medical bay of the long path, surrounded by his crew and by the strangers he had saved. He never saw the Accord founded. He never knew about the exemption. He never knew that his name would be remembered by species he had never even heard of. He sat in the cold amber light of the archive and did not move for a very long time. The water around him was still, floated nearby, silent as stone. Finally Key spoke. His voice was barely a whisper. He knew he was going to die. Yules's voice came soft across the water. Yes, and he went anyway. Yes, in the darkness behind his eyelids he could see the long path flying through. Locked gate, battered and burning, carrying the weight of a galaxy on its broken hull. And at the center of it all, a man on a stretcher refusing to stop. Keel left the deep archive the next morning. He rode the shuttle back up to Cradle Point in silence, sitting by the window, watching the pale blue surface of Asara shrink beneath him. He did not open his terminal. He did not check his messages. He just sat there and thought about a man named Eli Marsh, who had died on a stretcher giving orders to save people he had never met. The archive had shown him more than he expected, not just the story of the long path but the aftermath, what came next. After the wormhole collapsed and the era were sealed away, that was the part Key needed to understand now, not the war, the decision that followed it. When the surviving species finally gathered to form the Veyron Accord, the meeting was held on Asara, neutral ground, chosen specifically because no single species had a claim on it. Representatives from 19 species sat in a wide circular chamber built for the occasion. Some had lost most of their populations. The room was full of grief, exhaustion, and the kind of anger that comes from knowing you almost destroyed yourself. The agenda was long: trade agreements, territorial boundaries, military protocols, refugee rights. There were 1,000 things to decide. But before any of it, before the first official item was even introduced, the Morvathi delegate rose from the water basin at her seat and spoke. Her name was sure. She was Ulizi's ancestor, 3 generations back. She was old even by Morvathi standards, and her voice carried the slow weight of someone who had lived through things she wished she hadn't. Before we begin, Solar said, there is one matter that must be settled first. It cannot wait. It cannot be debated later. It must be written into the foundation of everything we build. Here today, the chamber went quiet. During the breach, Solar continued, we locked our doors, we sealed our borders, shut our gates, and hid behind walls of our own making. We told ourselves it was rational. We told ourselves it was necessary. And while we hid, billions of our people died, not because the era killed them, but because we would not open a door to let help reach them. She paused. The silence in the chamber was absolute. One species did not lock their doors. One species kept every gate open, every port active, every channel broadcasting. They flew through our sealed corridors without permission. They carried our wounded, sheltered our refugees, and delivered the data that saved us all. They did this not because they were strong. They did this because they believed, against all logic, against all reason, that a locked door is worse than any enemy. Salar looked around the chamber. 19 delegations, 19 species that owed their survival to a handful of human ships and the crews that flew them. I propose that humans be granted permanent, unrestricted passage through all controlled space within this accord. No gates, no clearance, no authorization required ever. This exemption will be written into the founding charter and may never be revoked. The veiled delegate, a tall officer who had served under Admiral Fesk, was the first to speak in support. He stood, all 4 arms at his sides, and said simply, Fesick told me before he died, if the humans had waited For permission, we would all be gone. I vote yes. The Tessari delegate voted. Yes, the Drenni voted yes, the smaller species, the ones whose names were barely known, whose worlds had been saved by human freighter pilots and volunteer medics, voted yes without hesitation. Every delegate, every species unanimous. The exemption was written into the charter that same day. Article 7, Section 44, Subsection 12. 3 lines that would outlast empires. When Key had first read those lines weeks ago in his office, they had made no sense to him. Now they meant everything. He arrived back on Cradle Point and went straight to the observation balcony. Overlooking the docking bay, he stood there for a while watching ships come and go. He saw Valith transport go through the full security process. Scans, forms, authorization codes. He saw a Tessari diplomatic shuttle wait in line for 20 minutes. He saw a small Drenni cargo vessel get pulled aside for a random inspection, and then he saw human freighter dock at the far end of the bay. A woman stepped out, short, brown hair, steady walk, carrying a medical kit over one shoulder. She was stopped by a security officer. He scanned her. She waited calmly. Officer checked the result, stepped aside and waved her through. No force, no questions, just an open door. That woman was Nora Beckett, and she had just arrived on Cradle Point to pick up additional medical supplies before continuing to HFY with Danny Voss. Keel watched her cross the docking bay and disappear into the station. He felt a strange pull, a desire to go down there and talk to her, to ask her if she knew what her species had done, if she understood the debt that every alien in this station owed to people like her. But he stayed where he was. He wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Meanwhile, Danny had already loaded the drifter with fresh supplies. Nora arrived at the ship, tossed her kit into the cargo bay, and climbed into the co-pilot seat without a word. Danny looked at her. You get everything we need, he asked. At antifungals, broad-spectrum antibiotics, rehydration kits, and enough nutrient packs for 200 people, she said. It'll do for now. Let's go. The flight to HFY took 6 hours. When they arrived, the colony looked rough. From orbit, a cluster of gray domes on a dusty brown world surrounded by dead farmland. The fungal outbreak had killed the crops first, then moved to the people. Quarantine barriers surrounded the main settlement, and warning beacons flashed in every direction. Danny docked at the colony's only functioning port. The airlock opened and they were met by the station's governor, a Valith named PRN. He was shorter than most of his kind, with a cracked shell on his left shoulder that spoke of old injuries. His dark eyes were tired, and his voice was flat with exhaustion. Human cargo vessel, Pren said, reading from a data pad. I see no prior authorization for landing in a quarantine zone. Danny opened his mouth to explain, but PRN raised one of his 4 hands to stop him. It's fine, Pren said. You're human, come in. Nora stepped forward. Where are you sick? PRN led them into the colony. The main medical building was overcrowded. Rows of CS filled with Valith colonists, many of them children, covered in the gray patches of fungal infection. The local doctors were doing their best, but they were out of medicine and out of time. Nora didn't hesitate. She set up a triage station in the middle of the room, sorted patients by severity, and started treating the worst cases immediately. Danny hauled supply crates from the ship one after another, stacking them where Nora pointed. He didn't complain, he didn't ask questions, he just worked. PRN watched them. After an hour he approached Danny at the supply dock. Can I ask you something human? Danny wiped sweat from his forehead. Sure, why did you come here? You have no connection to this colony. You have no reason to risk exposure to the fungal agent. Why? Danny thought about it for a moment. Somebody had to. PRN studied him with those dark, unblinking eyes. Then he turned and pointed to a small symbol etched into the wall beside the airlock. It was a simple image, a ship flying through an open gate. The same symbol was on every station, every outpost, every colony in the Accord. Do you know what that means? PRN asked. Not really, Danny admitted. PRN's voice softened just slightly. Just enough for Danny to notice. It means you earned that door a long time ago. Danny looked at the symbol. He had seen it before on other stations, in other systems. He had never paid attention to it. It was just a picture on a wall. He nodded politely and went back to hauling crates. That night, after the worst patients had been stabilized and Nora had finally sat down to eat something, Danny found himself standing outside the medical building looking up at the stars. The air on HFY was thin and dry, and the sky was full of unfamiliar constellations. He thought about what PRN had said. He thought about the symbol on the wall. He thought about all the times gates had opened for him without explanation. All the time security officers had waved him through with that same phrase, "You are human, you are exempt." He had never asked why. He had never cared enough to wonder, standing under a sky full of alien stars on a world he had no connection to, having spent the day hauling medicine for people he would never see again. Danny Voss still did not understand what made humans different, and maybe that was exactly the point. A fungal outbreak on HFY was contained in 4 days. Nora worked through most of them without stopping. She slept in short bursts on a cot in the corner of the medical building, woke up, washed her hands, and went back to treating patients. By the 3rd day, the gray patches on the worst cases had started to fade. By the 4th day, the colony's own doctors were able to take over again, armed with the supplies Danny had carried in and the treatment protocols Nora had written out by hand on scraps of medical paper. The children recovered the fastest. By the morning of the last day, a group of them had gathered near the cargo port where the drifter was docked. They were young, Valith, small, with soft shells that hadn't hardened yet, and eyes that were too big for their heads. They stood in a line holding pieces of paper. Danny was loading the last of the empty crates back into the ship when one of the children stepped forward and held out a drawing. It was crude, the kind of picture any child in any galaxy might draw. A ship flying through a wide open gate with bright yellow lines coming out from behind it like a sun. Danny crouched down and took the drawing. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at the child, who stared up at him with those dark, unblinking Valith eyes. "Thanks, kid," Danny said. The other children pushed forward, each holding a drawing. Some showed the ship, some showed a person carrying boxes. One of them showed 2 stick figures, one tall, one short, standing side by side inside a circle. Danny didn't know what it meant, but he took every drawing and stacked them carefully. Nora came out of the medical building and saw the pile of drawings on the cargo ramp. She picked up the first one, the ship through the Gate and studied it quietly. "Hute," she said. Then she walked into the cockpit and pinned it to the wall above. The navigation console, Danny climbed into the pilot's seat, Nora strapped in. Beside him, the drifter lifted off from HFY and the dusty brown world shrank behind them until it was just a dot. Against the black, they flew in comfortable silence for a while. Danny stared at the drawing pinned above his console, a ship through an open gate. "Nora," he said. "Yes," she replied. "You ever wonder if we deserve it, the free passage thing?" Nora thought about it. "I don't think it's about deserving. I think it's about remembering." "Remembering what?" "That somebody a long time ago did the right thing when it was easier not to, and the rest of us just try to keep that going." Danny didn't say anything for a long time after that. Back on Cradle Point, Hyle Drassen sat in his small office and wrote. He had spent 3 days organizing his thoughts since returning from the deep archive. He had read the records, he had heard the voice of the dead Drenny commander. He had seen the story of Eli Marsh and the long path, the locked gates in the 11 days that changed everything. He had watched humans walk through checkpoints that held everyone else for hours. Now he put it all into words. His report was addressed to the Tassari High Council, the governing body of his species. It was not a military briefing or a policy recommendation. It was something simpler. He called it a lesson. He wrote about how every species, including the Tassari, had sealed their borders out of fear, and how that fear had killed more people than the enemy itself. He wrote about how a single human captain with a battered freighter and a crew of ordinary workers had done what no fleet, no government, and no alliance had been willing to do. He had opened the doors. And then Keel wrote the part that mattered most to him. "We study the humans as if they are a puzzle to be solved," he wrote. "We look at their technology and find it average. We look at their military and find it modest. We look at their lifespans and find them short by every measure we use to rank species. Humans are unremarkable, and yet when the galaxy was dying, they were the only ones who moved. Not because they were strong enough, not because they had a plan, but because they believed in some deep and stubborn part of themselves that a locked door is worse than any danger on the other side. They walked into fire for strangers. They bled for people they had never met and would never see again. They did not ask for thanks. They did not ask for power. They simply kept the doors open and trusted that it was the right thing to do. That is why they are exempt, not because we owe them, because they remind us of what we forgot, that survival is not about walls, it is about doors. He read the report once, made a few corrections, and submitted it to the council. Then he left his office and walked through the station. It was evening by Cradle Point. Cycle. The lights had dimmed to a soft gold, and the corridors were quieter than usual. Keel walked slowly, passing through the commercial levels, the residential rings, the diplomatic wing. He passed species of every kind, tall Valith officers, clusters of chattering Drenny traders, a Morvathi diplomat, gliding through a water channel built into the floor. He made his way down to the docking level. He stood at the same observation point where weeks ago he had watched Danny Voss get waved through security and felt outrage burn through his chest. He stood there now and waited. After a while, a comm signal came through on his personal device, an incoming hail from an unregistered human Freighter requesting docking clearance. Key looked at the identifier. It was the drifter. He opened a channel. Human. Vessel drifter, this is Keel Dreen 2. Sorry Diplomatic Corps, welcome back to Cradle Point. There was a pause then. Dai's voice came through casual and a little confused. Thanks do I know? You know, Key said, but I know you in a manner of speaking. Another pause. Okay. That's not creepy at all. Key found himself doing something rare for a Tassari. It felt strange on his face. His scales shifted in a way they weren't used to, but it felt right. I have been researching something, Key said. The reason humans are allowed to pass through any gate without authorization. I wanted to tell you I found the answer. Yeah, Danny sounded genuinely curious now. What is it? Key thought about Eli Marsh on a stretcher, giving orders through broken ribs. He thought about Carla Dunn holding the helm of a burning ship. He thought about Sam Hadley on the hull in a pressure suit hacking a gate with frozen fingers. He thought about Nora Beckett pinning a child's drawing to a cockpit wall. He thought about Danny Voss, who flew medicine to a dying colony because somebody had to. Your people opened a door, Key said, when the rest of us were too afraid to do it ourselves, and the galaxy decided that the least it could do was never close a door on you again. Then he laughed, a short, awkward, very human laugh. I don't know anything about all that history stuff, man. I just deliver boxes. Key's smile widened. That, he said, is exactly the point. The drifter docked at Cradle Point. The gate opened before Danny even requested clearance. He walked through the checkpoint, nodded to the Valith security officer, and disappeared into the station to find a hot meal and a place to sleep. He did not think about why the gate opened for him. He never did. Somewhere in the station, on a wall that Danny had passed 100 times without noticing, a small plaque displayed the words that had been written into the founding charter of the Veyron Accord and installed in every station, every outpost, and every colony across the known galaxy. Let no gate be sealed against those who would open it for others. Let the humans pass. They have earned every door. It always